So when I was about 6 years old, my dad took me skiing for the first time. And we went to Winter Place, West Virginia. Anybody been to Winter Place? It's like right off of the interstate, really easy to get to. But I remember being so excited about the snow. I love snow. I grew up in Myrtle Beach, and we literally never got snow, so I was so excited about the snow. I was excited about trying something new and the thrill of downhill skiing. But I remember this one incident that really just sticks out in my mind, and I'll never forget it. So we were skiing. I'd kind of gotten the hang of it, gotten my feet under me, and just kind of casually skiing down one of the easy green slopes. And out of nowhere, a snowboarder comes just flying past me and nearly just took me out as he kind of crashed into the snow. And my dad was right there with me, and he's not an angry person, but I just remember just how mad he got as he grabbed this guy by the shoulders and gave him the business. No, not even really, he didn't get physical, but he was so mad, and he wanted to make sure that this guy understood that he was not happy about the danger that he posed to me and the other skiers as well. And so he made sure that he knew he needed to go more cautiously. And I tell you this story because I think it illustrates something about the way that Jesus relates to his people. See, in that story, that incident that happened, my dad stood up for me, not because he's some sort of vigilante snow patrol, but because I belong to him. And see, his relationship to me, and more specifically, his guardianship over me, is what led him to defend me in that situation. And I think the Bible shows us something similar to how Jesus cares for his people. And so as we're opening to John chapter 10, we're going to be looking at this sort of extended metaphor that Jesus uses to talk about his relationship to his people. And before we jump into that, we need some context. We need to know what's going on in the story, because this isn't just the writings of Jesus or the teachings of Jesus. This is actually happening within a context of what's going on. And so what's just happened in the story is that Jesus healed a man that was born blind. He gave him his sight. But the problem was that he did this on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees and the religious leaders were offended by it because by doing this, he broke their tradition by healing on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees, they're kind of in a frenzy, just trying to figure out what happened and trying to get. They actually come up to the blind man and say, who did this to you? Where was who is he? And that kind of thing. And they try to get him to confess or to say that Jesus was a sinner, because surely a man who broke their tradition, someone who healed on the Sabbath, had to be a sinner in their eyes. And rather than that, the man's like, look, I don't know much about him, but I know this. Once I was blind, and now I see. And so he confesses that Jesus is a prophet of God. And so what the Pharisees do is they kick him out of the synagogue. They excommunicate him from the community. And then Jesus comes and finds the man, and he reveals himself to him. He says, I am the Christ. And the man immediately worships him. And so this is the context of what Jesus is going to say here. And so the question that remains is, who is Jesus, and why does this man follow him and even go so far as to bow down and worship him, whereas the leaders, the Pharisees, rejected him? Because the expectation would have been that if Jesus is the Christ and the Christ is here, then surely the religious people would recognize it, right? Surely the ones who are leading the synagogue, leading the people of Israel would know, but they don't. They say he's not the Messiah. They reject him. And so Jesus begins this discourse. So let's read together John chapter 10, starting in verse 7. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father." That's where we'll end our reading today. And so Jesus, as we read that, you probably picked up on, he's got two metaphors that are going on here, and they're distinct. They're sort of using, they're communicating sort of different ideas, but both metaphors draw on this imagery of sheep and shepherding. Now, if we think about the biblical context for this, both of these are drawing on Old Testament imagery of shepherding. It was a common image that was used. And first and foremost, for the people of God, is that God himself is described as the shepherd of his people. So think about Exodus in the Promised Land as Moses, God through Moses led the people out of Egypt into the Promised Land. He's described as their shepherd who's going to take them and bring them into the land of promise, that they can go and come freely and just like sheep, go and graze on the grass. The people of God were going to go into the Promised Land, and God is their shepherd, leading them to the Promised Land. Or think of Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. So God is described as the shepherd of his people. But also in the Old Testament, God installs leaders of the people who are also called shepherds. So think about David, King David. Before he was king, he was a shepherd. That was his role in the society. But then when he became king, he shepherded the people of God. He had the responsibility to care for the people, to lead the people, to protect the people. But then we also have in the Old Testament these really pointed examples of what we might call evil shepherds, people that were supposed to shepherd, but things went wrong. If you've read the Old Testament, you know things don't go what seems to be the plan, that the leaders of God's people just fail time and time again. And so we get these passages in Ezekiel 34 and Jeremiah 23 where the shepherds of the people, the leaders, are condemned for taking advantage of the sheep, for exploiting them for their own gain and leaving them exposed to danger. So let's flip over to Ezekiel chapter 34, and we're just going to read a little part of this just so we really understand this context that Jesus is speaking into. Ezekiel 34, verse I just had 1 through 6, yeah. 1 through 6 of Ezekiel 34. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God, Ah, shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves, should not the shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and they became food for all the wild beasts. My sheep were scattered, they wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. My sheep were scattered over all the face of the earth, with none to search or to seek for them. And so we see how the leaders are condemned because they have exploited the sheep. They've left him out to expose to danger. But then God promises, he makes these promises in both this verse and in Jeremiah, that he is going to shepherd his people once again, that the Lord is going to be the shepherd over his people, and that he's going to set up this Davidic figure, this ruler from the line of David, who's going to be the shepherd over the people forever. So jump down to verse 23 of Ezekiel 34. It says, And I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, I have spoken. And so it's into this context that Jesus is speaking. The Jews and the leaders, the people of God would have been very familiar with this imagery and these promises of God from the Old Testament. And so when Jesus says things like, I am the good shepherd, he wasn't just coming up with another parable to tell them, but he was actually making a specific claim about who he was and what he was doing. So let's get into this. Let's look at the things that Jesus says. The first metaphor is that Jesus says, I am the door. I am the door. And he contrasts this, right, with the thieves and the robbers. And so if we think about the context of what's going on, who are the thieves and robbers that he's talking about? These people that came to take and use and abuse rather than protect the sheep. So Jesus is actually condemning the leaders, the religious leaders, the Pharisees of the day. And so think and consider the blind man, right? What just happened in the story. They had cast him out. And what did Jesus do? Jesus is the one who restored his sight. Jesus is the one who drew him back in. And so Jesus, by calling them, Jesus is calling the leaders thieves and robbers. They came to take and use and abuse and exploit for their own gain, whereas Jesus is offering something new. Jesus is offering something new to the people. He says, I am the door. Anyone who enters by me will be saved. And then look specifically at the words he uses. When we read this, it sounds a little bit funny in English because it's not necessarily a phrase we would use often. But look at verse 9. He says, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. So the phrase to go in and out and find pasture is actually covenantal language from the Old Testament. So back in the Old Testament, when Moses and the people are looking ahead at the promised land, and God has told them how to live, how to follow after him, right? And God promises Whoever obeys my commands will be blessed in their life, right? They will be blessed in their going in and their coming out. So this is covenantal language. And then think of another occasion where Moses is looking into the promised land and he prays to God that God would raise up someone to shepherd the people of Israel, to bring them in and to bring them out. And so this is very specific language that Jesus is using that has to do with the covenant. And so what Jesus is saying in all of this is that the covenant blessings of God promised in the Old Testament are now available through him. He's saying, I am the door. Anyone who enters by me will be saved and have this covenant blessing that God has promised. And we also see that Jesus, he is the better Joshua. And actually, the name Joshua, when it's translated into Greek, is Jesus. It is the same name. And so Jesus is literally the namesake of the one for whom Moses prayed that would bring this blessing to the people. So Jesus is the door, and Jesus is also, he uses this other metaphor that draws on similar imagery, but he's the good shepherd, right? And it's the good shepherd as opposed to the hired hand. And the point he's making is that the shepherd has a unique relationship with the sheep. He says that the shepherd is the one who actually cares for the sheep and will lay his life down for the sheep, whereas the hired hand will flee at the sign of danger. Because the hired hand doesn't have the same relationship with the sheep. And Jesus, of course, is pointing forward to his sacrificial death on the cross. It's Jesus' relationship, it's the shepherd's relationship with the sheep that drive him to protect them when danger comes. And he also says that the shepherd is going to gather all his sheep into one flock. And so what that's talking about is that he says, that I have sheep that are not of this fold that I must also bring in. He's talking about the Gentiles, the people, who were not the covenant people of God in the Old Testament, but this was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah and a few other places in the Old Testament. We see sort of a foretaste of that, and it comes into fruition. And so what Jesus is saying is that I'm going to make one new person with Jew and Gentile. And so at the end of all this, the Jews erupt into arguments, and some were saying that Jesus was insane, that he was out of his mind. But then others were saying, well, he can't have a demon because this guy, he opened the eyes of a blind man. How could he do that if he wasn't of God? And remember, all this is because, again, Jesus was making specific claims about his identity and the promises of God. Jesus said, I am the door, I am the good shepherd. And so what do we do with all this? What do we make of this? I want to draw out 3 observations that will help us get to the significance of what Jesus is claiming about himself. Now, you guys know that John likes alliteration, and I do too. So we're gonna use alliteration. The 3 things that we're gonna see are Jesus gives, Jesus guards, and Jesus gathers. So that's easy to remember, right? So we can easily remember the 3 points of the sermon. Jesus gives, Jesus guards, and Jesus gathers. And that's not just, it's a cute little, phrase that I came up with, but I do think that it really is what we're seeing in the text. And so the first one, Jesus gives. What does Jesus offer in this text? Specifically, look at the first metaphor when he says, I am the door. Anyone who enters by me will be saved. What is Jesus offering? He says, as opposed to the leaders and the rulers of the day that would cast out the blind man, whereas Jesus is the one who bound him up, as opposed to them who take advantage of the people for their own sake and leave them exposed to dangers, Jesus offers life. right? He says the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. But I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Have abundant life. What is he talking about here? See, we think of Jesus giving us eternal life, and we get the idea. It's life that never ends. It goes on and on and on. But does that mean that the life that Jesus gives us is just more time? A life that never ends, but maybe we're going to get bored. Maybe we don't want to live forever, right? But no, that's not just the idea. Jesus gives us life of a wholly different quality than the life we had before. A wholly different kind, not just a life that lasts forever. So what does it mean to have an abundant life? This idea of abundance. So when I was thinking about this, the idea that came to my mind when I thought about abundance was when Kelsey and I went on our honeymoon. We went to one of these all-inclusive resorts where you just pay a flat rate at the beginning and like all your food and everything is included. Has anyone ever done that? Or like a lot of cruises do that kind of thing too? I think that is like the greatest thing ever invented. It's great. I mean, I know it's, maybe it's not like always the best quality, but the fact that you can just pay it at the beginning and, go a whole week and not even think about, the food is just always there for you, right? It's just something just beautiful about just not having to think about it, even going out to eat. Like it's just always there. And I think that's a sort of a little picture of what it means to have an abundance, to be overflowing, to have no lack or no concern for lack. And what we need to consider is that God is not stingy or withholding. God is the giver of life itself. He isn't withholding from us. He wants to give us abundant life in Him. But the thing is, the abundant life, this life that we long for, is found in Jesus. That's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, I am the way. I came to give, to bring abundant life to those who would follow after me. And so, does that mean that when we follow Jesus, we just, all of a sudden, we just get everything we ever wanted, like He's our genie or something like that? Well, we have to remember, what does Jesus call us to do? What did He call His disciples to do? He called them to follow Him into death. And specifically, think about Peter. At the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus tells Peter that he's going to die for the sake of the gospel, right? He's going to suffer greatly for the sake of the gospel. And so, following Jesus and receiving the abundant life that Jesus offers, it's not just about, it's not a transactional thing. It's not, well, if we say the prayer and we say we're followers of Jesus, then God will give us this and this and this. No, it's an invitation to come and to know the one who is the author of life. See, the life that Jesus offers us is a life of a different quality. It is life that cannot even be broken by death. Because the life that Jesus offers us extends into the grave. It offers us resurrection. And it is through death that we find this abundant life. And the picture that we have in the Bible, the ultimate fulfillment of this, is depicted as a supper, as a banquet. We call this the marriage supper of the Lamb. When Jesus returns and gathers His people and restores all things, we see a feast laid before the people of God. This is what Jesus offers us. Jesus calls us to seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. Jesus gives us life of a different quality, of a different kind than we can even imagine. And so when we think about applying this idea that Jesus gives abundant life, are we tempted to think that God is withholding? that he's stingy. Sometimes it's really easy to feel that way, right? Like when things don't go our way or when we're trying to solve a big problem in our life and it just doesn't, things don't seem to be working or we feel like we're in need of something more. It's easy to kind of put that on God and to think that God is this kind of stingy, withholding God who we just have to beg and beg and beg, and then finally he'll relent and say, okay, you can have what you want, you can have what you need. But no, God is an abundant giver. He is presented as this gracious giver who delights to give good gifts to his children. And so we need to trust God, and we need to understand that God is gracious and a giving God. Or maybe it's easy for us to think about God as just transactional. Like if I do this for you, God, will you give me this, blessing? Fill in the blank. If I go to church, if I tithe, will you bless my life? Will you give me this promotion at work? That kind of thing. That's not how it works. Again, God is not transactional in that sense. It is a relational. It is a relationship that we're invited to know God and to experience Him because He is life. He is the abundant life that we're looking for. And then thirdly, I ask you to consider if you aren't a follower of Jesus, if you don't know God, are you looking for abundant life? Are you looking for that? I think we all kind of feel that at one point or another, that there's something within us that's just not whole. It's not complete. Nothing quite satisfies like we feel like it should. Even when we get everything we might want, it just doesn't quite do it. But I invite you to consider to look to Jesus because Jesus offers us abundant life. And so Jesus gives, and now we're going to look at how Jesus guards. And we're going to specifically look at the question of how does Jesus save us? Jesus is the shepherd that protects his people as opposed to the leaders of Israel who left them out exposed to danger, but Jesus is this protector of his people. And so how does he actually save us? What does that look like? And I want to look at something that's really, really interesting in this text that is kind of the foundation of this. Before we look at actually how Jesus saves us, we need to look at two relationships that are going on in the text. So looking at the metaphor of the shepherd and the sheep, first look at the relationship of the Son to the Father. When Jesus talks about the Father, so the Son knows the Father, and the Father knows the Son. So in verse 18, Jesus said, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father." So what we see is that the Son, Jesus, the Son, delights to do the Father's will. And in verse 17, it says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again." So we see that the Father delights in the Son's obedience. The Son delights in to do the Father's will, and the Father delights in the Son's obedience. There's no division between the Father and the Son. It's not that God didn't want to deal with humans, and so he sent his Son to do his dirty business and to go die on the cross. And it's not that Jesus unwillingly, against his will, went to the cross to somehow make the Father happy, but we see both Father and Son are united in their love for sinners. The Father and Son have conspired together to save sinners. And we see also that Jesus is very clear about what he's doing. His death on the cross was not some sort of tragic accident. It was not just the result of an evil plot, but it was the Father's will. And it was Jesus' willing sacrifice that he had the authority to lay his life down. And as he's speaking, probably within earshot of those who would plot against him and take his life, he wanted them to know that he was going willingly and not by their evil plan. And so we see the relationship from the Son to the Father, that the Father delights in the Son's obedience and the Son delights to do the Father's will. And then that also brings us into the shepherd's relationship to the flock, Jesus' relationship to the people of God. See, what distinguishes the shepherd from the hired hand is the relationship to the flock. That's why the shepherd is willing to put himself between the flock and the wolf, whereas the hired hand is not. And so, what we need to consider and remember is that sheep, as John mentioned last week, sheep are not impressive. They're sheep, right? It's not that the sheep were so impressive and that's why the shepherd was willing to do it. It's because they belong to the shepherd. And so what that means is that Jesus saves you not because you're impressive, but because you belong to him. Paul told us that at the right time, even when we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus doesn't wait for you to get your life in order and look impressive. There's nothing you can do to be impressive to God. There's nothing you can do, but we can delight in our Savior because he has saved us simply because of the mere fact that we are his. And so now we can look at the question. That's kind of our sort of foundation. What is it that Jesus has laid down his life to save us from? Jesus says he lays down his life for the sheep, on behalf of the sheep. And this language is it's sacrificial. Like in the beginning of the Gospel of John, where John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." See, what Jesus saves us from, what we are in our own flesh utterly defenseless against, is our sin. It's our sin and the consequences for us that our sin has. Our sin separates us from God and demands judgment. But we see that the shepherd, our shepherd, has come to lay down his life to save us from that, to save us from the judgment that we deserve, to save us from our own sinful nature. And what's so amazing that we see here is that the shepherd has the authority not only to lay his life down, but to take it up again. See, if we're thinking that sort of the metaphor world that we've created of the shepherd and the sheep, if the shepherd does die defending the sheep, well, they're saved from that danger, but then they're still exposed because the shepherd's gone. The shepherd's died. But what's beautiful that we see here is that Jesus laid down his life and he also took it back up again. He was raised so that we could be vindicated. So what we know is that we still have a shepherd. He has dealt with the threat and he's able to shepherd us even now. He's still able to protect us from the dangers that would come to us. And so, how do we apply this? How do we think about what it means that Jesus guards, that Jesus saves his people? I think most foundationally, we need to delight in the shepherd. See, the Christian life is not primarily about just being a moral person, but it's about knowing and delighting in someone, about knowing Jesus, our shepherd, and delighting in him. And out of that delight and joy and peace and hope that gives us, We offer our lives as living sacrifices of worship to Him. We give our entire lives, not just an hour a week, not just on Sundays, but our whole beings we offer to Him. So rest in the fact that Jesus knows you, that He's not disgusted by you, that He doesn't merely tolerate you, but He knows you, and He calls you His own, like a shepherd to his sheep. So we've seen that Jesus gives, Jesus guards, and finally, let's consider how Jesus gathers. And we're going to answer the question of what does it look like to follow Jesus, to be a shepherd, or to be a sheep of the flock. So think about the metaphor itself of shepherding. The metaphor of shepherding actually points us to the communal nature of following Jesus. Sheep follow a shepherd in a flock, right? It's not just individual sheep happen to follow the same shepherd, but it's a collective unit. It's a flock of sheep. Or even consider the other metaphors that Jesus uses about leaving the 99 sheep to go save the one, right? He doesn't just save the one from danger, but He brings the sheep back into the fold, the sheep, the flock. And so what we see is that we also see that by His death, Jesus talked about how He was going to bring, He has sheep not of this fold, that He was going to bring into one flock. So it's interesting here, and I don't think until I started thinking about this and studying, I don't think I realized the sort of linguistic distinction between a fold and a flock. But a fold is just like a pen. A fold, it's just it's a sheep pen where the sheep graze and gather and that kind of thing. But a flock was the unit, like the sort of family unit of sheep. And what Jesus is saying is that I have sheep not of this fold, speaking of the Gentiles, because remember, He's going to the Jews first. He's the Jewish Messiah. But He says, I have sheep not of this fold that I'm going to bring in. And He says, not just into the sheepfold, not just into the pen where we have this group over here and this group over here, but there's going to be one flock, one shepherd. And anyone that has ever worked with animals before, you know that animals can be kind of temperamental sometimes, right? So mixing flocks, like making a new flock out of two previous kind of distinct flocks, does not always go well. And I think it's the same for us, right? It's difficult for us to unite with people that are really different than us, right? But this is what Jesus is calling us to do. Jesus' sacrifice has produced something new. So following Jesus means not only putting up with other people, but loving people who look different than us, who think different than us, who make more money than us, who make less money than us, who run in different social circles than us, who prefer different things than us. But we are united by our one shepherd. And this isn't a new problem for us here today in Greenwood, South Carolina. The early church dealt with this. You can't get more distinct than Jew and Gentile. They literally have laws that forbid them from eating together, right? But what Jesus did by bringing in the Gentiles, by including them in the promises of God, He creates one new flock under one shepherd. So let's look at Ephesians chapter 2. Verse 14 says this, "For He Himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in the flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. Jesus' death on the cross produces a new kind of community, a community that's not marked by skin color or socioeconomic status or by trade or even by physical location, but Jesus creates a community that is united together by mutual love and delight in the one shepherd. And so we, as followers of Jesus, need to embrace this community. We need to embrace each other. You guys, we're all different. We're all unique, right? But we need one another. We're invited into this community together. To be a Christian is to be a part of the flock of God. And we also need to love those who are different than us. We need to see that the kingdom of God is not bound by culture or heritage or tradition, but it is bound by those who would follow the one shepherd. So let us look to Jesus, our shepherd who laid down his life for us. Let's embrace and celebrate the abundant life that he offers us. And let's be united together as his people as we witness to the world around us about what he has done.